So, during the 2023 World Cup, India were just absolutely dominant. And halfway through, I started thinking about how do you beat this team? And more specifically, when we got towards the semi-finals and the final, how do you actually beat India? So I had a look at a way that Australia could actually overcome India. So now we are going to reverse that. Australia are the current World Test champions, right? And not only that, they beat India. But while you might not be thinking of Australia as an incredible team at home these days, and there's reasons for that we will get to in a moment, it is worth looking at their recent form. So in the last 3 years, they have won 12 matches and they have lost 1. It's pretty good, right? That's pretty good. You would take that. And the reason you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not sure they're quite that good, is partly because of what India managed to do at the Gavaskar, right? But also the 2 series back-to-back. India played incredible cricket against Australia in those series. So it makes sense that even though you might see a record like this, you might more be thinking of something like this. It's also worth noting that Pakistan played there last year, and Pakistan actually had plenty of opportunities if they played better cricket to maybe even steal a test or 2 off Australia. And then the West Indies were there, and they actually did steal a test off Australia. So while the recent form is still very good, there's no doubt that in the last summer, they didn't look like the all-conquering Australian team. But beating Australia in Australia is still a very, very hard thing. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Let's take a look. This was made using MV Play's Insights. The same technology that supports the England and New Zealand test players is available to club cricketers as well. Let's be really honest, Australia are the best at noting that other countries are rigging their wickets. And Australians will say, we don't even have to doctor our wickets. But within that phrase lies a lot more truth. The bounce that you get on Australian wickets is simply not like anywhere else in the world. And it's consistent and it's all the way through the majority of the surfaces. Even a pitch like the SCG, which isn't bouncy by Australian standards, is very bouncy by rest of the world standards. There is good, decent bounce all the way through it. And it means the ball comes through to you very differently than it does when playing test cricket anywhere else on earth. So Australia has a natural advantage that they've always had. And it's not just a ground like the Wacker, which is very important. It really is countrywide. If you're coming to Australia as a batter, you're going to have to handle the fact that the ball is going to be at you a lot more. And it's also going to be bouncing in a slightly different way. If you're a bowler, it's kind of the opposite. You almost have to not get too excited by the bounce and just bowl normally. But sometimes it's hard to do that when a couple of balls get taken by your wicketkeeper above their ears. So that's why the first thing that most people look for, and England was absolutely obsessed with this, is tall bowlers when you go over. Most specifically tall seamers, but we've also seen some tall spinners go over as well, picked for the Australian conditions. England won an Ashes doing that, and then they tried to replicate it with a bunch of bowlers who weren't very good, and it didn't work. And I think that's the secret, really. Don't just pick tall bowlers because they're tall, but if you have 2 bowlers of equal skill and you're not quite sure which one to go between, probably pick the guy who's 6'7" over the guy who's 6'1". Even Australian batters don't particularly like to face good tall bowling on their pitches. It's just what it's made for. It's why Australia has so many of those kinds of bowlers when you look at domestic cricket, because once the new ball stops doing anything, tall bowlers are really, really important on Australian wickets because they give you an extra over, because they're always in the game in Australia. The other thing, as I said before, tall spinners also helps, but so does just top spin in general. It's just a different way of bowling spin in Australia. Putting sideways revs on the ball doesn't always help all that much, whereas putting overspin on the ball and actually getting the ball to dip and then bounce means that when you're playing spin in Australia, it's a very different kind of playing spin than everywhere else. I think it's one reason why Australians struggle so much sometimes when they go to the subcontinent, because you can be a great player of spin in Australia and not a particularly good player of spin anywhere else in the world. And that also comes for, well, certainly over the last decade or so, if you're coming to Australia, you have to handle line. Those 2 things are obviously linked quite a lot. But even if it wasn't line, if you go back, it was Shane Warne beforehand. You're going to lose wickets to seam bowlers. There's nothing you can do about that. That's not quite the case with spinners. I think sometimes teams get a little bit overexcited about attacking the spinner. And it's like, if you think you can have a go at him and take him completely out of the attack, okay, go for it once. But generally what happens is Nathan Lyon picks up wickets because teams do actually come for him. So teams, when they have been successful, have come up with plans with Lyon to just minimise him in that series. The other thing that you really need to know about Australian wickets is that they are new ball dependent. They always have been. If you go through the whole history of Australian cricket, the ball does a little bit at the start, then eventually the pitch flattens out and people make a lot of runs. And by people, I generally mean Australians. If you look at the record of Australian batters at home compared to away, there's a lot of players with really, really high test batting averages that is almost all from them just killing people on Australian flat pitches. So if you don't make the most of the new ball, that can be tricky. And for some teams, this combination is a little bit weird because new ball bowlers aren't always the same as tall bowlers. So the combination of both of those things is actually far more important. And it's one reason why Stuart Broad is probably a better bowler to take to Australia than Jimmy Anderson, even if you think Jimmy Anderson is the better bowler. The other thing here is bat long. These wickets get flat, and Australians will score a lot of runs on them. If you have a look at when Australia is beating teams, it's quite often with scores of 450 plus. These aren't shootouts, right? You actually have to outlast Australia, and the longer you bat, the better. It's also why draws are quite important in Australia as well, because if you can bat for a very long period of time, the wickets don't always deteriorate in the same way. And so if you look at historically, even when Australia was great, the teams that did best weren't beating Australia as much as they were drawing with Australia. That's always an option. Even in this last 3 years, they've gone 12-1, but there has actually been 2 draws as well. So traditionally, that is a good option. The other one is to get to day 4. And this might sound a little bit weird, but if you've been in Australian grounds, I think you'll know what I mean by this. To beat Australia, you really want to take the test as long as possible. Obviously, the draws is a big part of that, and the batting long is a huge part of that, right? But by day 4, Australian crowds are quite small. Australian crowds on day 1 and day 2 and day 3 are massive, and they are loud, and they are in your face. And if your fielders go out to the boundary, they will be abused. They will be heckled. They will be told they are no good for hours on end. That is a really hard thing to handle. By day 4, that's not really the case. Australian fans, even when the team has been really good, have always gone early in test matches and then just kind of petered out by the end. If you can take matches to day 4 where it's still a, 50-50 shot, you are a huge chance of winning. That is historically how teams have done well in Australia. A spinner who can't get hit out of the attack, handling the local spinner, whoever that may be, not being blown away by the new ball, batting as long as possible, maybe looking for a draw, but certainly keeping the game interesting into day 4. Essentially, some of this is just boring Australia because of the way that they want to move the game on. There's nothing I've put here that really is all that surprising, and most people who've watched a lot of cricket would know about it. But there is one major issue about everything I've said here. The last couple of years, something has changed in Australia, and a lot of this no longer plays a big part at all. And that all comes down to, weirdly enough, an Australian company called Kookaburra. You may have heard of them. They make hockey equipment. They also make cricket balls. And a couple of years ago, they were very upset that everyone was slagging off the Kookaburra balls, and they were talking about another ball called Dukes, or even SG, and saying that those were the better balls. And so Kookaburra went, okay, well, we're going to change our ball. We're not really going to tell that many people, but we're going to change it. We're going to reinforce the seam and make that seam a little bit stronger. And they completely changed the structural integrity of a cricket ball while still keeping it as like a legal, normal cricket ball. Since that's happened, there's been one very big change in Australian cricket, and that's the wobble ball. Before that, the wobble ball wasn't really seen as an effective thing within Australia. Once Kookaburra changed that ball, the wobble ball completely took over. Usman Khawaja was talking about recently that if you look at first-class cricket, no one is making any runs. And he was basically saying just how much the pitches had changed and how much the bowlers were on top. Well, the pitches might have changed, the bowlers might be on top, but I can tell you that it all links back to this new Kookaburra ball and the fact that everyone in Australian cricket now bowls the wobble ball. So these two things here have made draws very, very unlikely, but they've also made batting long very, very hard. And before I said that the new ball was the most important thing. The new ball is no longer all that important. And also, I would take it one step further and say the whole idea of just having tall bowlers doesn't make as much sense anymore, because what you really want is your most skillful bowlers now, which is not something that you traditionally wanted when you were coming to Australia. You wanted big, tall, fast bowlers, right? So the conditions have changed quite a bit. So instead of batting long like you might have in the old days, we're looking more at low scores now, right? The averages in Australian test matches have dropped dramatically. And now, to be able to win in Australia, it's not putting on 450 or 500 and getting an advantage. We look at a lot more scrappy matches within Australia, low-scoring affairs where there can be a lot of collapses. In fact, I think it's most noticeable in the middle sessions. In the old days of Australian cricket, kind of in the middle sessions, it would go towards the batting team almost automatically. It was very, very hard to get a wicket. The pitches under the baking sun just always seemed to go that way. But because we're having a lot more low scores, and because the games are a lot more scrappy, it means that the middle session is now completely open, and it's just changed the way that Australian cricket matches have been heading. So this is Australian tests, okay, in the last 3 years. And this is average, and this is overs. So this is the Australian team. So these dots here are the Australian team. So you can see with the new ball, they've been okay, Australia, but they've been much better between overs 20 and 40. Traditionally, when a kookaburra is absolutely pathetic. But now the kookaburra is dancing, or laughing, I suppose, everywhere. And so it means that even between overs 40 and 60, the average is almost identical to overs 0 to 20. But because there's so many extra wickets falling earlier in the game when the Australians are bowling, it also means that by the time they get to 60 and 80, there is just a huge drop off of the average. So you can see here that the new ball isn't really any better than the ball between the 20 and the 60 over mark. And then by the end, they're just cashing in with tail enders. But you can see these black dots here. This is when you filter in the overseas bowls. And it's important to put them in as well, because otherwise it could just be that Australians are bowling really well at the moment. But you come up here and you can see that there's a slight rise when you go from the new ball in the first 20 overs to the ball between 20 and 40 overs. But again, it's pretty similar. And that number keeps completely level all the way through. And then it does drop off again at the end, partly because there are so many wickets being taken all the way through. So the patterns are slightly different, but it basically holds up. The new ball is no longer dominant the way that it once was, especially for the Australian bowlers. And so that means there's no getting past the new kookaburra and then just batting normally. You're constantly under threat, the same way that you would be in, say, somewhere like New Zealand and England. Now, the wickets aren't green, but the ball is clearly doing something. And to prove this, let me just show you where these numbers were before. 5 years previous, the overall numbers were up here. It used to be that there was almost 40 runs per wicket in Australia from 2015 to 2019. And you can see just how much of these numbers are less than this one. It is completely different bowling in Australia now than it has been throughout the history of the game. So all of this is just backing up what we said, that we are seeing more low scores. And so the game is very, very different to what it used to be under the old Australian conditions. I'm not going to go through India's squad because this is a video really about beating Australia. But I thought India had the chance of, say, picking Kuldeep and Hardik Pandya and Mohammad Shami. Now, injuries and selection decisions have kind of moved them on from that. So their team isn't perfect. But I thought if they had the ability to pick that perfect team, there's actually a few chinks within the Australian team. Yes, I know, 12-1, but obviously the second opener spot is massively open and no one's quite sure what's going to happen there. It's worth also remembering that this year, and that's only from about 5 or 6 test matches, Usman Khawaja has not been making a lot of runs at the moment. Remember, I've talked about him before as being a batch player, someone who puts all of his runs in one area. If he's now batting with a weak opener at the other end and he can't find his form, it means that at the top of the order, Australia are giving a big opening. At home, for more than a decade, they have had David Warner with either Chris Rogers or Usman Khawaja or whoever it may be, absolutely dominating. So straight away, one end is opened up, and it's possible it could be both. The other thing is that Marnus Labuschagne is not looking like the Marnus Labuschagne who took the world over. When I started writing my book about the greatest batters in Test cricket, he passed all of our metrics, and we had to take a look at him. By the stage I'd started writing the actual book, he was no longer even in the conversation. And then you have Steve Smith, who, let's not forget, was the second opener not that long ago. I don't know which Steve Smith we're going to get. Is he suddenly going to explode into more runs because he's not opening anymore? I would never put anything past Steve Smith because I once doubted him and he went on to be almost Bradman for a little while. So he could easily bring back his form. But it does mean that their entire top 4 is a little bit looser than they would want. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. I mean, it's probably a good thing for Australia that Mohammad Shami is not going to turn up for the first couple of games. And then they've got their bowlers, which is an aging bowling attack, but it certainly hasn't aged out yet. Hazelwood, absolutely no questions with Hazelwood at the moment. I think over the last few test matches, he's been absolutely incredible. I could be wrong, but it feels like he's been averaging like 13 over the last couple of test matches. He's doing okay. Stark has been in a bit of a funk for a long time. I actually think this is linked to the wobble ball. I think when Australia started training him up to learn how to bowl with the wobble ball, he struggled a lot because he lost his conventional swing. So at the start of the innings, he no longer had the impact that he used to, and he's never been a control bowler. And I think the wobble ball really needs a lot of control. I don't think he's finished as a test bowler, but I'd be very surprised if he's consistent all the way through their 5 test matches, and even averaging 30 over those 5 test matches from him would probably be seen as a win based on his recent form. Then you've got Cummins. The only real issue I have with Cummins is he's no longer godlike. That mode that he used to have, it's just not there anymore. And I'm not sure what it is. I don't know if it's just his body catching up to him or teams have worked out how to play him a little bit more. But there's no doubt that when you look at Pat Cummins at the moment, he's not looking like he's going to end up with a bowling average of 20 or 21, which he was on the path for. It's just slowly creeping up. Now, it's creeping up from like Glenn McGrath levels to Dennis Lilly levels. We don't need to panic about him at all. But he needs to be completely on top of his game to help out with the fact that Stark may not be. But I think the real issue could be the 5th bowler. It's very different than the Indian teams that came over with Pujara, right? Because you come over with Pujara and, draw is an option and batting long is an option almost all the time. But the way that India beat Australia was definitely tiring out, all 3 of these guys as much as possible, which is why having a proper 5th bowling option is much better for them. Unfortunately, all their batters who could be their 5th bowlers are currently injured. So in order to do that, they might have to bring in someone like Aaron Hardy, who's a very, very talented player, but it's a bit of a risk. And I think it's more of a risk at the moment because the top 4 is not as solid as they would want it to be. Again, I don't think there's anything here that is the end of the world, but you put all those things together and Hazelwood's the only one I think sort of in near his peak form. Everyone else is struggling a little bit at the moment. I don't think there's any real doubt about that. Hazelwood is the only one that you're absolutely certain on. I don't think Cummins is going to bowl poorly, but whether he can find that previous form is quite interesting. Stark is definitely the biggest question mark, and if Stark is a question mark, you really do want a strong 5th bowler, and at the moment they don't quite have that. So I think with all of this at the bottom here, it actually makes Australia quite vulnerable to a team playing some good cricket. Let's just go back to the West Indies here. You don't really expect the West Indies to beat Australia. So yes, 12-1 looks absolutely incredible, but when you factor all this in, I don't think these are the Australian conditions that a lot of these players even grew up with. I'm not saying they're not used to them, because it's been happening for the last few years, but cricket in Australia has changed a little bit, and I think it makes it a little bit more even for the other teams. Australia still being the world's best team, right? So it's not like the end of the world or anything, but there are little things like the Gabatoir is no longer the Gabatoir. And the WACA, actually there is no WACA anymore. Well, there is a WACA, but they don't play test matches there anymore. So there's still bounce in Australian cricket, but I'm not sure it's as big a factor as it used to be because of this change over here as well. It's still going to be really hard for India to win this series, but the point being for India and any other teams coming to Australia at the moment, it might be a slightly more doable prospect than it used to be in the past. And if you're an Indian team that already pulled out one of the greatest upsets against Australia in the last series, I think they should be looking at this thing and going, I don't know, maybe we could beat them. So if I'm India and I'm looking at all this, I'd be thinking, okay, maybe we've had some injuries, maybe some things have gone against us, but all things considered, there's still a chance. And so there is definitely a chance. Although there is one thing I think I forgot to write on here. And the reason I put it here is because of Stark. Because Stark in day-night matches is a completely different beast. And Australia in day-night matches is a completely different beast. In fact, I said they were 12-1 in the last few years. They are 11-1 in day-night test matches. That is absolutely insane. But when I said there was a chance, there's a reason for that. Because when the West Indies beat them, that was a day-night test match. As I said, there's a chance. I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories, like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the Empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.